Well, thank you all for staying. So I wanted to first thank the Provincetown Art Association and Museum for hosting this symposium, Land, Place, and Identity, and for inviting me to participate both in the selection process and in moderating this discussion. We received numerous proposals for this, and it was a real pleasure to be able to go through them with Ruby T. and Megan Hinton and Maura Coughlin. We had, in my opinion, I think Maura and Ruby did the bulk of beginning that process of really looking through and getting down to a little bit more of a manageable number for us to review. But there really was such amazing selections, and in going through that long process of deliberating, we really thought that today's presenters and yesterday's would create an amazing conversation, right? Not just in the larger context of land, place, and identity, but also in conversation with each other from one presentation to the next. And I think that it shows from today. I really enjoyed that personally, so thank you all. I'm gonna both begin this conversation, but also open it up to you all, because I know, when I was sitting in the front row and taking some notes, Maura leaned over and said, you think about this, and I was like, I need you up here. So when we open up the conversation, hopefully some of those questions will start. So I'm going to start by presenting this from my own perspective, right? As a painter, as opposed to an art historian, I think about the work a little bit differently. And part of that is not only being interested in the content of the presentation, but also how you end up, getting after it in your own personal research, right? And I was considering, follow me for a second. This is going to go somewhere. I was considering how to kind of house thinking through your presentations and your research, and of course, ended up filtering through my own practice. So as a painter, you're often, made to categorize what you do, right? Everybody wants to, have you be able to get that quick soundbite. So what kind of painter, or what kind of artist are you? And inevitably it's like, are you a realist? Do you work abstractly? And I've always said, representational painter, because it's more open. And recently I started to think about, and this is where we're going here, I started to think about, how those things water down and how language is used within our practice. And I have a colleague who, refers to himself as a perceptual painter, right? And when looking at his work, you think of him as a realist or an observational painter. He's out there, painting plein air, etc. But it started me thinking about this idea of perceptual painting. And perceptual paintings, not mere descriptions of what you see, but they contain artistic inventions made in response to sensory experience of the external world and the medium of itself. So I thought that was poignant in the way, each of you were having this conversation, and had me thinking about this idea of authorship. And no matter what you're doing, whether it's a research paper or an artwork, it's filtered through the individual that's making it. And your own identity, experiences, etc., change the way we perceive the world. We could both be looking at the same thing and come at it at a different angle because it's being filtered through us. This is a long way of me actually asking you all to talk a little bit more about first yourselves and also how you came into these particular, the most recent, for some of you, research projects, and whether you think about that aspect of authorship, right? Yourself when you're entering into the research, or how you come to it. So maybe I'll start with, since you're right next to Crystal.
Okay. So a little bit more about myself. My overall research interests, or research program, I'm not really sure how to qualify it, is invested in thinking about how Black life gets represented beyond the trauma narratives that tend to define it. So I'm really interested in Black pleasure and Black joy and quotidian Blackness as it relates to the experiences of joy and pleasure, and how that gets represented in art, visual art, performing arts, film, video, really any medium. I'm interested in exploring that language, that visual language that is used to describe Black experience and joy. And what was the other part of the question? Sorry.
No, that's actually great. I mean, more of this is just kind of I want to know more about yourselves. Mm-hmm. And then, just within that, how you kind of enter into this practice, how you enter into this particular research project. And I think you get into that.
Yeah.
And you're an artist as well?
I am also an artist. I make photos and videos and objects. It's like performance-based work that I do. How I get into it, how I got into my research is all these little pieces just kind of came together and made sense. But I was really moved by all of the extrajudicial killings that were happening, and the way that these violated bodies of young Black men and women, mostly young Black men, were being shown on the TV and in the media. And I was very disturbed by this. And I thought, we need to not necessarily ignore all of that, but we need to, in the discourse around it, it was like, this is what, the discourse was sort of pushing this notion that Black life is death, and woundedness. And so I was intent on trying to figure out how we can speak to that, but not have it be the defining aspect of Black life, because Black life is rich and it's varied, and that wasn't being shared. And so I wanted to really focus on that and be a part of sharing, these amazing moments that happen in everyday Black life that nobody gets to see because, we're being reduced down to violent encounters with the police and with proxies for the police. So that's how I came to be working on this stuff. And but it is a battle because the conversation around like Afro-pessimism is so strong. And there are a lot of like great intellects who are pushing Afro-pessimism, and it's like, you know, I'm just an assistant professor and they're senior scholars.
I mean, similar to just talking about, you know, even the roots of the discussion today, you know, in broadening the canon, right? In bringing in these other voices to what came from this history of landscape. Broadening the canon and bringing this history, which was, you know, I'm just thinking of. Oh, I gotta go to the notes. Just thinking about this conversation around Emerson's novel on nature, which then led to this conversation around landscape, right? And the landscape artists that you showed at first, Hudson Valley, et cetera, right? We're trying to broaden the canon in the same way, dealing today and trying to move against the larger conversation of you know, Black pessimism, you know, trying to widen it and talk about joy, right? Just throw the other side. You're still bumping up against the resistance of who and what is important to discuss, right? So I love that. I love that. Thank you. Let me carry on.
Yeah. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. A little bit about myself. And yeah, I think, and how I came to the research, yes. Well, I think where I started in my presentation today, and very similar to you, it was really, I think, around that time, 2019, 2020, really leaning on the landscape for refuge in a moment where we were locked down and we were also confronted with so much death, and going to these spaces that for a moment of reconnecting. And I think for me, it's growing up in Virginia, and I think my mother's story impacts how I think about arrival and place a lot. That is a question that I come back to in my practice in general, and why I think soil becomes such an important material for me, because she was born in Seoul during the Vietnam War. My grandfather, who was a Black soldier stationed there, adopted her, brought her back to the U.S. She was raised by his Black family, who was pretty in Virginia, kind of in the 60s and in the 70s, and kind of feeling really isolated. And also in that transition, this is the uprise of kind of the large adoption project coming out of Korea, and like a mass exodus of mixed race babies, and that kind of positioning her in a place where she is still to this day without kind of citizenship within the US. And so growing up, this also affected me and our family, and where we were able to go, what we were able to do. And I became really sensitive to, I think, just what does it mean to arrive? What does it mean to create home space? What does that look like? Is it ever possible? And I think in my practice in general, there's this tension between the acknowledgement of kind of these histories of violence, because we can't have selective amnesia, I think, and like forget what is happening, and at the same time really focusing on aliveness as a way to position some sort of hope. And I think that happens so much, I think, like you were saying, in the quotidian, in the everyday, in these ephemeral ways that aren't within the larger narrative. And so I grew up gardening with my grandfather, picking corn, harvesting, like growing up kind of on the land, and I didn't realize how important that was to me until I got older, and that also became kind of my mother's language, and how she was able to kind of express her creativity, and especially the types of plants and that she would bring into the home, and this connection to them that essentially created a connection to a home place that she never, or she didn't have access to. So and then, you know, you also just think about how intertwined we are with the land, especially in Virginia. The soil is really red, it's really rich, it's very iron, a lot of iron, and iron is also the thing that moves blood in our body. And just having this super, for me, this thinking about, especially this Boston project and authorship, it really was important, and I think this conversation has been happening a lot in this, these discussions of decentering myself, and because there's been so many afterlives that are simultaneously existing, and so thinking about the past as being inherently part of the present and influencing the future, and for that I couldn't, and especially I think when we're thinking about public memory, is decentering my personal experience and including the community in a way where they actually feel like they are being seen and heard. And also for me, that is a practice of what it means to translocate. And I feel like that is like the story of my family, it's the story of me, and like what does it mean, and how do we create community and solidarity within those spaces.
I love that. Thank you. And Asia.
Thanks, you guys have spoken so beautifully about this. And from artist perspective, and I'm not an artist, I'm a historian of art, which I think really sort of informs the perspective I feel like I'm approaching this research from. I spent a lot of time in various archives, particularly in Moy's archives, which, as I mentioned, are in DC and in Syracuse. And I really think about sort of digging through those histories and recreating them as they need to be, or sort of creating them and surfacing for the first time in certain cases. With artists like Moy and other artists, I really think about sort of responsibility to the artists themselves, to the sort of legacy of that artist, but responsibility across and between communities as well, to bring things to the surface that have been overlooked, whether it is in these really sort of rigorous academic art spaces in institutions like this that are more local, or even a sort of outside of the art world, just in our conception of who we're talking about when we're talking about artists and American artists in the middle of the 20th century, or now. I think those ideas are really transforming recently. I think there's a lot to say about changing canons or transforming canons, but I try to not talk too much about changing a canon and think about sort of maybe disregarding it. And I guess this is a hot topic that you can always go back and forth. Should a canon be changed or reconsidered or done away with entirely? And I think Moy is a really interesting case study into how to approach this question, how to talk about history and legacy in a way that sort of has a life moving forward.
I love that. Thank you. And I'm only going to ask kind of one more question, and I'll open it up to you all to include your voices in this conversation. There were two threads with the next. One was thinking about liminal, because a couple of you were talking about liminal space in the work, which is what I've always understood as transitional space, but also occupying a position that's on both sides of a boundary, right? That's the definition. So that was one thread. And then the other thread really was an umbrella I feel like, that went through all of your work, which was material language, right? Both in Carrie James Marshall and your own work, how material isn't just like, not just thinking about the image in the end, but also how to build it and the importance of the material in which creates that work and its symbolic nature. So I'm going to open it up to either of those threads, but just I feel like they're two really beautiful places to have a conversation. So maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think liminality and the concept of liminality and the concept of border crossing, figuratively or literally, is a big theme of my work. My dissertation has the word border somewhere in the title. I can't remember the exact what I have titled it exactly today at the moment. But yeah, this idea that I think it's useful to think of, sort of remember that frontiers are borders, and sort of being this idea that artists can be sort of to be groundbreaking, sort of to be liminal, which is really perhaps too broad, too abstract to put a fine point on. But maybe I'll sort of talk about abstraction as a kind of liminality that I think is really significant for talking about race as we sort of are here today. It's sort of talking about race means to talk about a visual excess, something that is too sort of defined by its indefiniteness, its sort of lack of scientific sort of its scientific validity. Just that sort of in turn means that the representation of race is really something that I feel is always liminal. There's always a question of, I think for any non-white artist in the United States, honestly, how should I represent myself? How should I represent the world around me? How should I represent my presence in the world around me? And I think this liminal space between abstraction and representation is something that I am constantly returning to, and thinking about how when the subject or the figure or the lack thereof is not the first or the easiest thing to talk about, how can turning to materiality, turning to process, turning to what exists beyond the artwork, how can that also give us a way to think about these questions of things that are not so tangible or not so readable immediately in a work?
Yeah, I'm just going to bounce off of your thought. And I think you can see this a lot more in my earlier work, but material becomes a proxy for the body. It in itself becomes inherently racialized. I was actually really interested in the orange in the earlier work because of its ambiguous racialization, and because of the its history of colonization and it's the way that it's come to the U.S. and it being inherently this hybridized fruit that I thought was really something that I felt very connected to as someone who is biracial, of using an orange as I'm not using like a banana or a watermelon or something that is has this long legacy of racialization and within the U.S. context. And I do think a lot of times material, and I talked about the way that Lisa Lowe kind of thinks about intimacy, this practice of intimacy within her research, but that also kind of is a way in which I think I approach material is not thinking about the material history siloed, but I'm really interested in these moments where the canon of a material becomes complicated, and and looking at the way that it is simultaneously being used, referenced, transferred, manipulated within different timelines, different places, different contexts to then create a more nuanced relationship to that material. I think for me that starts to think about, or that inherently I think is going with how I think about my own, the way that I inhabit like the world. It's just inherent, I think, to who I am, and thinking about my family story, thinking about the legacies of displacement within that has happened, and the way that culture gets preserved and identity gets preserved. I think for me, it feels inherent to exist within that liminal space, because it's one of of more possibility that isn't within, I guess, the canon of certain materials. And I'm talking very broadly, like theoretically, or like really broadly right now, but in my practice, I also look at the relationship between porcelain and sugar and ornamentation. And I think this is also where keloiding comes back in, and thinking about this relationship to beauty from different perspectives as kind of this way to reimagine other ways of existing.
So I think about Kerry James Marshall's use of blackness, like black paint. And it's difficult to talk about it because, blackness can be read as blackness, racial blackness, but really I'm talking about blackness, the color, and his deliberate deployment of this rich, undeniable black that he uses to render his figures, I think is important to pushing a certain kind of conversation that people want to have around race representation, pushing it to a new place. But it's also difficult because, taking something that is so dark, and not really, and I preface this by saying I haven't quite figured out my positionality to this, but it's a question that comes up for me is, does using this black paint to create these figures in the portraits, does it allow for people to come to a more nuanced understanding of what black identity is? Or does it just, or does it fall into this idea of the monolith, like the myth of the monolith? And, I don't have a position on it yet. I do understand his, why he uses extreme blackness, what he hopes to achieve with it. So I think about that a lot when I look at his work. I love his work, and I think he's a brilliant artist. But I think a lot about it, and I just wonder if the conceit is how can I phrase this? If it's doing the labor, is it doing the labor that he wants it to be doing?
I mean, I love that, and I don't know, well, maybe Carrie James Marshall seems very, distinct and specific, in the sort of planning out of things. So maybe he knows, but I often think, as artists and as intellectuals, it's like asking questions, right? You don't need to necessarily know all of the answers, but it's like the question creates the conversation. And I think in part of that, Carrie James Marshall's probably trying to interrogate, right? Make it as black as possible, make it like, have that be, unequivocal. And therefore, then all of a sudden that starts this conversation, right? That starts the questions. And maybe there isn't an exact answer, or that answer is going to change through time. But speaking of questions, I'm going to ask you all if you have any questions for our fantastic panelists here. Thanks.
Okay.
This question is potentially a little bit muddled, so you might need to give me a second. LaRissa, at one point you said, like repair, soil moves slowly. And I love that. That really spoke to me. And I think about the idea that we can only heal at the speed of nature. And like you said, we don't want selective amnesia, and there's no magical pill to forget or move past all of the histories we're entangled in. And hearing you talk about that, I thought about something Bayo Akomolafe said, which is, what if the way we respond to the crisis is part of the crisis? And, wow, sorry, I'm really nervous. Seeing as you had all talked about joy, I was wondering what lessons and teachings of gentleness and patience and compassion and hope have you all found through your work with archives or organic material? And how do these act as holding devices for you? I love that choice of holding devices in relation to the soil. Felt like a lot of care in that choice of word for like a container. So yeah, thank you so much. This has been amazing.
I can start. Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, so I think, just to repeat the question back to you to make sure that I'm hearing what you're saying, is how in my practice, how am I finding care or reprieve through my material, through like combating with these histories that I'm dealing with? Is that like paraphrasing correctly? Yeah, I think for me, it's the first thing that it was a shift around how I approach time, and with time expectation. And I think it was really a lesson of learning how to let go. And for me, that was really difficult. It was an act of surrender, and I think that's what working with soil has taught me. Because as much as you want to contain it, control it, manipulate it, it is going to do what it wants to do, and using it, and with using it, and especially using it site specifically, dealing with these histories as well, I think it is such an alive material that it in itself encapsulates everything and still can produce some beauty, some life. And I think that in its essence is why I can continue to return to it, because the material itself is hope and continues to be hope. And so for me, that has really just been a healing process. And Calvin Warren talks about Black care in this essay. I can't remember when exactly it came out, but he talks about kind of the register of care that is required to kind of contend with a wounding of the spirit. And like, what does that look like? And how do we create space for that? And how do you even express that? Because it can't even be capsulated within words. And for me, working on this last project, going to ground, it was something that I was really spent a lot of time with, was imagining what was this community around Zipporah that like held her, that allowed her to maintain this land for over 2 decades in colonial Boston. And I was like, I want to recreate that. So everyone on my project was a femme, and I really just created a community where I felt like we were all had space, and we're holding like that space for each other, and not only kind of caring for each other in the process, but also allowing space for some of these like expressions to exist that are beyond kind of the language of it. So I feel like I'm still continuing for it to teach me, but the thing that again just keeps me coming back to it is, in a time I think where we all need hope, it is a visual reminder, and quite literally something that provides it.
More questions? Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for your presentations and for doing this. This has been really lovely. My question is about kind of programs, as you were using the word, Crystal, like this idea of like kind of this behind this intention. In Spanish, we have this word that's like literally translated to like disquietude, which like is related to like what moves you, what is not still in you, sort of. And I think that like after hearing you all speak, I was thinking about how like making space for the project to be like soil coming from others to this place, or making space for like abstracting a landscape and turning that into like the grounds in which like the landscape becomes alive almost in this new way. And also thinking about like that painting you shared that has like was revised in order to show something new. And I'm thinking about like this decentering, which is maybe also related to liminality. But I was interested in your own programs, or the programs that are behind sort of this project of decentering and making space for, and what there is the grounds for when you do that sort of work, whether that's in abstraction or in your own practices or in the research. Thank you.
So what's behind it is, like, I am fully committed in my research to mine the possibilities of living life otherwise, depicting life otherwise, and I'm committed to these artists who are doing that work. And part of the labor involved is first putting yourself out there, right? You put yourself out there and you find the work that is doing something doing something interesting, doing something compelling with what where in the proximity of your interests. And, going to that artist and putting yourself at their mercy, really, to understand their language, to understand their process, to understand, I don't really like to say to understand the artist's intent, because the artist's intentions can change over time. But to understand, what is bringing the artist to a specific place and why. So it's a lot of give and take, and a lot of trust is involved, and that there's also, you have to remember that, speaking as someone who is an art historian, I have to honor the work, I have to honor the maker, and I have to honor the process that the maker is going through, and respect it. There's got to be a lot of respect and trust there. And to make sure it's not extractive. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Asia, did you want to take that too?
Yeah, I guess I'll just sort of briefly respond. I think maybe I'm a bit biased, but I really do agree with Moy's notion that abstraction really, I think, says a lot and leaves a lot unsaid as well, that I think can be really productive and generative. I think there's so much in this process of recovery, whether it's in the archive or just sort of taking a new look, recovering what can be seen in a work of art when you look at it again or look at it for the first time. There's so much, sort of going back to the other question, so much joy in that recovery as well, so much to be learned from that process. And I do think there's something specific to not trying to place a figure, trying to, even when we're looking at an abstract landscape like this, there's a lot more than just a beach, I think, that you can see here. And I think there's a lot of space in that abstract work, or even in a figurative work like Marshall's, that is really hard to parse sometimes visually. That can be really rewarding and really, I think, generative. It feels alive, it feels very vital, especially, again, I'll just maybe thinking about printmaking and color woodcuts as well. There's so much sort of remembering the history of the process and the literal materials that, for me, as someone who is not an artist, doesn't work with art objects outside of sort of in this context, I think it's always good to remember this process of making that's so easy to overlook when looking at paintings that I feel like sometimes I really, in this process of studying Moy, have appreciated in forms of art making other than just painting or... I'll leave it there. Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to be time-wise. Do we have time for one more, or how
Yeah,
are we doing?
we do, yeah. And I wasn't sure, LaRissa, do you want to take that question as well, or would you like us to move on to a next?
I can definitely answer, and I'm open to answering that after, but
Okay.
I think one more question might be nice.
Great.
I want to thank you all for really poignant presentations and insights. And a lot of beautiful words were expressed by each of you in trying to communicate the potential or the power behind the works that were examined in terms of things like geography of freedom, a black aesthetic or eco-aesthetic, make a fallow land fertile fields, this kind of surfacing of other or alternative histories, this kind of living archive that can be continuously interrogated. And all of that suggesting a kind of liberatory practice, right, of how to represent and experience and speak about Blackness in a way that is liberatory. This idea of also joy, very powerful, to own joy. And in each case, in order to not maybe in each case, but in order to talk about that, there's the impossibility of not always having to also engage with, interrogate the dominant violent narrative in order to then demonstrate the alternative, right? So this idea of Blackness as always transgressive, Blackness as always queer, and this idea of always being caught in a liminal space. I thought the idea that liminality, as you pointed out, James, is not just a transitional space, but actually both sides of the boundary. So I guess my question is there any way to escape this process? Is liberation possible for marginalized identities, people's lives, especially within US society, because every culture, every society is different. Is there a possibility for liberation? Or is science fiction has been a model that has been used? I'm thinking of Afrofuturism. Science fiction as a way to really show a black imaginary that is separate from the legacy of enslavement and all the other abuses and all the violence. Can we exist apart from the violence, even as we strive for joy? So I'm wondering, and I guess I'm also referring to, regardless of people's political persuasion, the violence that was just committed by the election, and how that's making you rethink about liberation through your research, the art you interrogate, or the art you create. So I don't know that if that makes any sense.
So I'm of the mind that there is no escape. And what we have to do is really find ways otherwise that we must, find our way towards communities, build communities that are predicated on care and repair, and nurture those communities, because the violence is the structure of this society that we live in, the American society, is predicated on violence, various kinds of violence. And as you just mentioned, we had a really violent experience on Tuesday. It felt very violent and violating. So while looking towards the future with something like Afrofuturism is being encouraged by different groups, and I'm definitely interested in Afrofuturism. I teach an Afrofuturism course. I also am thinking about the here and now, and how do we enact modes of living unfettered in the here and now. And that takes a lot of support. And I think it also takes a willingness to let go of, some of the trappings, social trappings, capitalist trappings that, the trinkets and stuff that we all get caught up in.
Yeah, and I just want to, if you don't mind, I'm with the same feelings, and I just kind of want to sit with this notion of care too, and also point out that care does not mean no conflict. I do think that within communities of care and repair, there will be conflict, but it's how you move through and create space for conflict. And I think this might go back to another question earlier of what happens when you decenter yourself and allow others to participate in building community. And doing projects that very much relies on that, there has been conflict, but I think creating that space, it's like any other kind of relationship, interpersonal or not, is learning how to become a good listener and holding space, and also being able to then have these conversations that are hard to have. How do you have them without putting people on alarm? How do you disarm and come humbly to the conversation? And I think situating yourself, and even in my practice, very much acknowledging kind of the impossibilities of escaping the violence, but still choosing and really striving for these moments of creating otherwise places, spaces, possibilities in the real reality of what is happening and has happened. There's still, I think, this level of humbleness, and or even with how I'm using kind of my positionality to come to the conversation that is really necessary, I think, in these communities to create safe spaces.
Yeah, and I only have a small comment as well, but I do really think that as important as endurance is and thinking about the future, I think there's a part of it too that it's almost like it doesn't matter what the future holds. What's really important is living for community in the present moment, and really orienting our projects, whether it's art or research or wherever we sort of end up, these sort of community building attempts, thinking, within and without of institutions, how things can look in the future is so important, but also how they're looking in the present too. So empowering and so really motivating to keep it all going together.
Yeah, I think endurance, I just want to sit with that word for a second, because I think it's really important because it's a skill, right? It's something that you have to build up. When we're talking about care, we're talking about action, right? We're talking about repetitive action even when you don't feel like doing it. It's like you're building a tolerance, right? And I think that word endurance really encapsulates at least what I try to do in my practice, and I think that you both are doing within your research as well.
This is one moment in one room in one conversation, and bringing a little, hopefully, focusing on bringing a little joy, but creating a space for a conversation within a larger discourse. So I want to once again thank Pam for the opportunity, and you all as audience members to be able to have. As receivers and thinkers within this moment, I feel like all the questions afterwards, everybody, like I'm doing now, everybody's in the same mode. It's like you're pushed into the space of deep thought, right? So it's like this contemplation. I'm like, all right, how do I'm unpacking this and talking through it, which is, in my opinion, the epitome of success for a symposium or for a panel, for everybody to be leaving in this place, this generative place of questioning and thought. So thank you. Yeah.
I just want to second the thank you, especially thank you to the four of you.